All right, so next we're going to talk about the specialized compartments for food processing. Basically, we're going to go through all of the digestive organs: the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine. And then we'll go into the accessory glands and organs. We have the salivary glands, pancreas, liver, and gallbladder. The regions of the GI tract can be specialized to process food. We're going to see both mechanical digestion, the physical breakdown of food into smaller pieces, and then the chemical digestion, the breaking of chemical bonds so that the complex molecules are broken into those smaller subunits. We need to break those polymers down into monomers. So we're going to start off with the mouth. The mouth is going to be the oral cavity. Some of the functions of the mouth, I'm sure you can guess, are going to begin the mechanical digestion. We're going to begin both mechanical and chemical digestion. We're going to monitor food quality and moisten and manipulate the food so that way it can be swallowed. We're going to do this by using teeth, salivary glands, and tongue to contribute to these functions. The teeth and mechanical digestion. Here we have our mouth in our oral cavity. The structure is that it's going to contain teeth. The teeth are going to function in mechanical digestion. They're going to break the food into smaller pieces. We have incisors, which are responsible for clipping and slicing, canines that'll puncture and tear, and molars and premolars for crushing. So we have our incisors up here, canines, premolars, and molars. The structure is going to be the crown, which is the region right up here above the gum, and the root will be the region right down here below the gum. Tooth decay is a homeostatic imbalance of the mouth. Tooth decay is caused by bacteria digesting trapped food and producing acid. That acid is going to erode this enamel away from the outside. Plaque, an invisible layer of bacteria, mucus, and food, is going to help promote tooth decay. This is why it's so important to brush your teeth after every meal, not just in the morning and at night, but every time you eat. Little particles of food are going to be left on the surface. Bacteria on the surface can start to break down that food. When they break it down, they're going to produce acid through anaerobic respiration. They're going to break down that food, ferment it, and produce an acid that can slowly eat away at the enamel found on the surface of your tooth. Gingivitis is another homeostatic imbalance of the mouth. It's caused, or it is inflammation of the gums, and it can develop into periodontitis. That's the inflammation of the soft tissues around the tooth, which can actually cause the tooth to become very, very loose and even fall out. This region up here in the crown is going to be above the gum. This layer down here below the gum is called the root. The layers include the pulp. The pulp is going to be the innermost layer of the tooth. This is where we find blood vessels and nerves. Your teeth are alive. They are being constantly nourished by your blood vessels. Constantly growing tissue. And so this is why it hurts. This is why teeth can hurt if they are drilled into. This is why teeth hurt when they fall out, is because we are severing nerve and blood vessels that are found inside of the tooth. Just outside of the pulp is the dentin. The dentin is going to be hard and bone-like. The enamel is what's found on the surface. The enamel is going to be non-living, and it ultimately covers the crown for our last layer of protection of the tooth. When we're looking at the mouth as the cavity, we're going to look a little bit at its structure. The structure is that it's going to contain salivary glands. The salivary glands are going to be responsible for chemical digestion. So teeth are primarily responsible for mechanical. The salivary glands are going to contribute to the chemical digestion that happens within the mouth. There are 3 pairs of salivary glands that are going to be found. We have the sublingual glands, found just below the tongue. We have the submandibular glands, found down below here, below the jaw, and then parotid glands, found in front of the ears. They're ultimately going to be responsible for releasing saliva into the mouth. The water is going to moisten food, mucus binds to food, and the enzyme found in saliva is going to, salivary amylase, begins the chemical digestion of starch down into sugars. Little home experiment that you can try. Take something that's not particularly sweet, like a saltine or maybe a piece of bread, and just suck on it. Hold it in your mouth. Chew it up, but don't swallow right away. I know it's kind of gross. If it grosses you out too much, you could just spit it out. You don't have to swallow. But chew it up, hold it in your mouth, hold it against your tongue, and you might find that your initial sensation is salty, but within a few minutes, you should start to taste some sweetness. This is because the enzyme amylase found in your saliva is breaking that starch down into sugar right inside your mouth. So that chemical digestion begins here. The next organ in your mouth that is responsible for aiding in this chemical and mechanical digestion is going to be the tongue. The tongue is primarily responsible for taste and food manipulation. Now, taste is very important as part of it helps tell us the quality of food. It helps tell us what we are eating. If it is poisonous or bitter, we may be induced to spit it out. Something that might be harmful to us. Our tongue will tell us, hey, this is not okay, spit it out. So the tongue does actually play an important role in digestion in that it tells us about the quality of the food. But it also plays a very important role in food manipulation. The tongue is a very large skeletal muscle. It's responsible for taste, speech, manipulation of the food mixed with saliva, and it helps with aiding in the beginning of swallowing. In fact, the movement from the tongue helps form the food into a bolus. It's a soft mass of food suitable for swallowing. One thing that I learned from my students last time I taught this class, I personally do not have a lot of experience in the medical field, but many of my students do. I had a student who told me that because the tongue is so specialized and so skilled and so very important in the food process, that in hospital settings, when they are moving a patient from perhaps a feeding tube to being able to eat on their own, or when they're moving them from a liquid to a solid diet, they bring in a speech pathologist, not a dietitian, because one of the most important things is to see how well they can manipulate and move their tongue. If their speech isn't clear, if they are having difficulty speaking, if they're having difficulty manipulating their tongue, they're not yet ready to be able to swallow food whole on their own. And so I did not know that. That's something I learned from my students, is that a speech pathologist, someone who understands the finer movements and abilities of the tongue, is ultimately responsible, not a dietitian, for noting when a patient is ready to move on to the next step in their dietary needs. So there you go. So what we have here is sort of a diagram of the process of swallowing. So getting food, chewing it up, and swallowing. The pharynx is going to be a passageway that's shared by the digestive and respiratory systems. It's going to be this region right up in here. This is where swallowing happens. This is a voluntary component. The tongue is going to push the bolus back into the pharynx. Once we get back into the pharynx, then an involuntary reflex is going to start to take over, or an involuntary component / a reflex is going to take over. The soft palate is going to prevent food from entering the nasal cavities. The larynx moves up, causing the epiglottis to cover the glottis, which is going to, here's the epiglottis, it's going to cover the glottis, and we're going to force food down into the esophagus and not into our trachea. So here we go. Here is the process that causes that epiglottis to slam shut and our food to slide down the esophagus. The esophagus is a muscular tube that's going to transport the food from the pharynx to the stomach. Food moves along the esophagus to other regions of the GI tract via a method called peristalsis. Peristalsis is the rhythmic waves of muscle contraction. Doesn't play a role in mechanical or chemical digestion. Its main goal is just to transport food. So here is going to be our esophagus. We're moving the bolus down into the stomach. What we're going to see is this wave-like contraction that's going to move the bolus. That's peristalsis. And like I said, it has no role in mechanical or chemical digestion. It's just a transport method. Next up, we go into the stomach. The stomach is going to be a J-shaped expandable sac. It's going to have a band of circular muscles, sphincters, to guard the opening at each end. Those sphincters found at each end are going to prevent things like, well, what do you suppose? What do you suppose the sphincter at the top of the stomach does? And what is its role? If that sphincter that leads from the esophagus into the stomach is weak, we can result in heartburn, acid reflux coming back up out of the stomach up into the esophagus, into the back throat. It's not pleasant. So that sphincter at the top of the muscle is very, very important. The wall of the stomach has 3 layers of smooth muscle. They're going to be longitudinal, circular, and oblique muscles. Ultimately, the goal of the stomach is going to be to store food and regulate its release into the small intestine. It's going to liquefy the food into a form called chyme, and it's going to begin the chemical digestion of proteins via various enzymes. What we're going to find in the stomach is that there are going to be gastric glands. The gastric glands are going to secrete hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid is going to serve multiple functions, one of which is to kill bacteria. It's also going to break down the connective tissue of meat and activate pepsinogen. Pepsinogen becomes pepsin in the stomach when exposed to hydrochloric acid. Pepsin is an enzyme that's going to help break down and digest proteins. Some of the gastric glands will secrete intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is a protein that's necessary for the absorption of vitamin B12 from the small intestine. There is very little absorption that happens in the stomach. Very, very little absorption. The primary goal of the stomach is not to absorb anything, but to create a very acidic environment. So we're going to create a highly acidic environment. We're going to activate pepsin, start the digestion of proteins, but we're not ready to absorb anything into the bloodstream, which makes sense. We have a highly acidic environment. Would we want to be absorbing that acid into the bloodstream to be spread out through the rest of the body? No. However, there are some molecules that can be absorbed in the lining of the stomach. Alcohol and aspirin are 2 exceptions. This is why alcohol works very quickly. As soon as it reaches the stomach, it has the ability to be absorbed and sent into the bloodstream and then to the brain or wherever it is it needs to travel. So here is an example of the structure of the stomach. The stomach itself is going to be protected from gastric juices by several layers. So here we have the 3 layers of muscle, but talking about the inside, the lining of the stomach is going to be protected from those gastric juices by mucus for one. Pepsin is also going to help protect the lining of the stomach from gastric juices. There are also neural and hormonal mechanisms that time release gastric juices to coincide with food entering the stomach. So food absorbs and then dilutes that gastric juice. So we don't necessarily have a lot of acid found in the stomach at all times, or if we do, it's considered a homeostatic imbalance. Stomach lining is also going to be replaced quickly and frequently. We're going to be replacing that stomach lining to help protect against too much wear and tear and damage due to the exposure to those gastric juices.